Podcasts have been described as experiencing a meteoric rise in the past year. According to recent metrics, there are currently more than 700,000 active podcasts totaling over 29 million episodes in more than 100 languages available to the average consumer. And with more and more hosts working to connect with listeners on a more personal and emotional level, it's no surprise to learn that sound is the most effective way to build trust among consumers. In this episode, Nathan Spell and I are putting Copywriting 101 on a brief hold as we take a look at the recently released study, Your Brain on Podcasts, which was jointly produced by Wundery and Mindshare's NeuroLab. Today, we will be speaking with Hernan Lopez, founder and CEO of Wundery, who will be leading us through this study of trust and emotion in the podcast advertising space. So let's get started.
That's the great thing about Stamps.com. They grow with you.
As much fun as I had, I couldn't wait to get back to my Sleep Number bed.
Yep.
I love my Third Love bras. They're hands down the most comfortable bras I've ever owned.
I love making Blue Apron. I love it. It's my me time.
Hernan, thanks so much for joining us today. Most of our listeners will be familiar with you and with Wundery, but for those who aren't as fully immersed in the podcast industry as we are, would you mind introducing yourself and talking a little bit about the company?
Yes, I'm the founder of Wundery. We started the company about 3 years ago. We're best known for shows like Dirty John, Dr. Death, The Shrink Next Door, but we also make some of the most engaging ongoing shows like Business Wars, American History Tellers, Imagine Life, and the brand of Wundery is known for what we call emotionally immersive storytelling, shows that make listeners feel they're in the middle of the story as the story is happening. And we also do some fun comedy interview shows like Life is Joy with Justin Long.
So we're here to talk about your brain on podcasts, and there's so much to cover there. But first, could you just talk about why Wundery commissioned that study in the first place?
It's funny. Before I started Wundery, and before I even was a podcast listener, I was surprised by every time I heard somebody recommend a podcast to me, they were so excited and so worked up, and so they just could not stop talking about how much they love podcast A or B. And in many cases, they were talking about Serial, the podcast that really started this new golden age of audio storytelling. So I kept wondering, is there something that happens in the brain that is different when people are listening to a podcast from anything else? Because I just couldn't see that reaction from almost anything else. And when fast forward 4 years later, I am reading an issue of Adweek, and I get article about Mindshare's NeuroLab, and I know the people at Mindshare, and I start reading, and the article describes that they launch a neuroscience research center within Mindshare, and that the first study that they did was called The Power of Audio, and I start to read the headlines of the study, and one of the interesting data points I found intuitively obvious or intuitively true, but I hadn't seen any proof for it before. And it's the fact that people respond to audio in a much more powerful way that they respond to visuals. And I thought I have to read it and I have to get in touch with them and find out more.
Can you walk us through the study itself and what sort of methods were used and what exactly the results were?
Yes, let's first clarify that there are two studies. There's a study that Mindshare did on its own, but it's important to talk about that one in particular. They use EEG, electroencephalographic scanning, galvanic skin response. So EEG is obviously, a lot of people have done EEG for a medical treatment. Is when they put sensors somewhere. In this case, they're all attached to your head, and they essentially measure. And I'm sure I'm going to sound like I know what I'm talking about, but they measure changes in the electricity and in your brain. So they measure the exchange, the intensity of emotions and the valence of emotions, and they measure the degree to which memories are being formed, what's called memory encoding. They also complemented with something called a galvanic skin response. This is where they put a sensor attached to your skin, and they see whether your skin, again, changes the degree to which they conduct electricity. And then finally, they added eye movement research and implicit trust association research. So combining all of those research techniques, they wanted to get to the bottom of whether people respond to audiovisual ads versus visual only ads versus audio only ads in a different way. And the insight that they came up with is that they observed that obviously the smartphone has become the number one screen for all of us. And they noticed that most modern consumers engage with smartphones using only one set at a time. They're either looking at their feed with another screen without the headphones on, or they're listening to something without looking at the screen. So they had they wanted to test a very long-held assumption that visuals are more important than audio. And that's something that most people assume, even media planners assume, which is why so much more money spent in visual media than in audio media. And they even asked people, the respondents of the survey, the respondents of the study, before they started the study, do you think that you prefer visual stories or audio stories? And most people said, yes, I prefer visual stories. So then they attach all these sensors to the brain and they start to measure what happened in reality. And what they found was fascinating. First, they found that audio-only ads were 21% more powerful. They had higher emotional intensity than visual-only ads, right? So audio alone is more powerful than visuals alone. And they also found that audio-only ads had 89% of the emotional intensity of audiovisual ads. Obviously, you're always going to get the highest response to an ad with both sight, sound, and motion. But in this case, they proved that most of the power comes actually from the sound and not from the visuals.
Do they know what causes that difference? Why audio is more effective in that way than video or visuals alone?
They don't explain that in the study, but I've read, and I'm sure you guys have heard multiple times, that sound is perceived by your brain faster than any other sense. And then there's the other the other long-held belief that when people are listening to something, they make a mental picture in their brain that is better than anything else that they're seeing. And there's no real way to test that assumption, but that's an explanation that I've heard about why audio is so emotionally powerful.
I just want to clarify, both for myself and I think for listeners, are we talking about the initial study at this point, or is this?
Yes. So this is all the initial study. And so when I read all that, I thought that there would be an opportunity to specifically test podcasts because their study was about audio in general, and I don't want to test podcasts. And I wanted to compare podcasts not to every other kind of audio or not to any kind of visual ads. I wanted to make podcasts compare themselves to video ads on smartphones. You guys obviously are in the media planning world, and so you guys will resonate. The video ads in smartphones are the only other units that can communicate an emotional message, and coincidentally or not, their CPMs are similar to podcast CPMs, and they are more widely used than podcasts today for a number of reasons. So the design of the study centered around two of our podcasts, a storytelling one, Dr. Death, and an interview one, Life is Short with Justin Long, and two brands. One was a very widely known direct response advertiser. The other one is a streaming service, and we tested podcast ads in two versions, host read and producer read, against real ads that both of these brands had run on those media, on social media video tailored to ads, tailored to smartphones. And we wanted to make sure we're testing them in the same length. So we tested 15-second ads and 60-second ads in both cases, podcast versus social media video.
What were the results of that study, and how do they differ from? Obviously, they differ in what we were looking for, or what you were looking for in that study. But what exactly were the results?
So well, that study is what we ended up calling Your Brain on Podcasts, and essentially the difference between this study and the other one is was specifically focused on podcasts. One of the first things that we found surprising was we did an implicit trust association study on both of those brands before and after being exposed to an ad. And we found that after a single exposure to a podcast ad, trust in the advertised brands went up, whereas after a single exposure to a video ad for the same brand, trust in the brand went down. That to me was remarkable. Yeah, I mean, it wasn't remarkable that trust in the brand after listening to the podcast went up. What was remarkable was that trust after watching the ad went down. The second thing that we found very interesting that was consistent with what they had seen in the prior study was that the emotional intensity for a podcast ad goes up as time goes by. So there's a peak towards the end of the ad, whereas in social media video ads, the emotional intensity and also the memory encoding go down toward the end. And this is very important for brands to realize because those last 5, 10, however many seconds of the ad are typically the moments when we're talking about the brand. So you have this dichotomy of when people are listening to a podcast, their attention goes up at the end, and when people are watching the ad goes down. And so that is exactly when you want people to remember more.
What do the results mean for advertisers and publishers in terms of how they should think about prioritizing their ad spend?
I'm biased, so of course I don't think that people are going to be surprised to hear me say that they should be considering adding more podcast spend. I think the podcasts are making a very interesting transition. It used to be an experiment, and then went into a nice to have. We're at the point where podcasts are going from a nice to have to a must have in every media plan, because consumers are spending so much time on the smartphones, and they're doing many things on the smartphones, but most of the things that they do with the smartphones are done in short periods of time. Podcasts are one of the only mediums where listeners or consumers engage with for long periods of time. And that's the only way in which you can engage with ads for long periods of time.
I totally agree. And I think a lot of folks here would also agree with that. I can't tell you the number of times that I hear people jump in and they're like, oh man, I listened to all of these episodes while I was, traveling to visit my family or going on vacation. So
there's another very interesting slide that Mindshare created. It says podcast memories are likely to sustain over time given the strong emotional component. You guys probably have heard, or maybe some of you experienced it, the anecdote of the mother who lets their kid put their hand on a hot stove so that they can remember that's the way they'll never forget that if you put your hand on a hot stove. Right. But if you tell the kid, don't put your hand on a hot stove, the kid will have to do it. So emotional memories are more durable. I mean, that's something that good teachers know, that good storytellers know. So given that podcasts have such a strong emotional component, the memories that they create are likely to sustain over time.
Well, we may be a little biased as well, but we've obviously felt that podcast advertising gives brands a real leg up, especially when it comes to fighting to earn that trust and attention. We've known that was the case, I think, but it's really cool to read through the study and see, that competitive advantage like quantified, I think, especially at the level of the brain. And then with the second study that you commissioned to see, how those, different formats play out. Is there anything that we missed about this study that you'd like to add before, we let you go?
There's another very interesting side of the test is that we tested, two things actually. One is that we tested host-read ads versus producer-read ads because we just wanted to see how much stronger. We all know that in the podcast space, DR advertisers prefer host-read ads, whereas brand advertisers are generally indifferent about them. We support both kinds of format ads. The only one format we don't support are pre-produced radio ads because we don't want podcasts to sound like radio. And we found that host-read ads were the best performing format indeed. They had 30% higher emotional intensity than social media ads, video ads.
Wow.
But even producer-read ads had 23% higher emotional intensity. So the difference between even a producer-read ad and a video ad was much bigger than the difference between a producer and a host-read ad.
Wow.
And then the other part of the story is that of the study is that we asked we tried to test whether a kind of ad fits better into a kind of environment, specifically storytelling for higher emotion and interview for higher attention. That's what we found. So we found that emotional intensity for host-read ads in storytelling environments is higher than it is for interview-style environments, whereas memory encoding for host-read ads in interview-style environments is higher than it is for storytelling environments. So the headline for this slide would be use emotionally intensive copy in storytelling environments and use factual copy in interview style environments. But at the end of the day, you guys always do what you do best, which is have the talking points delivered to the host, and then let the host put those talking points in their own words. And that's going to be the tried and true, the best way of how your ads be successful.
I love that we're on the right track.
Yeah.
Well, Hernan, thank you so much for joining us today. This has really been fascinating. I've really loved listening to you talk about this and getting to read it prior to having you on. And I'm really excited to see how all of this continues to grow and evolve.
Thank you very much. It was such a pleasure to be talking to you guys. Congratulations on launching your podcast. I listened to episode 1. I still need to follow the future episodes. And please call me anytime. Copywriting is something that I feel very passionate about. It was my first job. That's how I started to work in media. And I think that good copywriting is underappreciated and is way more important than people realize.
If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe for updates on future episodes and leave us a comment with your feedback, questions, or ideas for future segments. Please be sure to join us next time as we dive back into Copywriting 101, voice, tone, and content, and the important distinctions between the three. This podcast was written and hosted by me, Lindsay Boyd, and Nathan Spell, with sound mixing and editing by Freddie Trejo. This podcast is an Ad Results Media production.